Good morning. Today we are pleased to welcome our speaker, David Bollier. He will address the commons as a new paradigm for reimagining economics, politics, and culture. These issues are addressed in his recently co-authored book, Free, Fair, and Alive: The Insurgent Power of the Commons. I would also like to mention his earlier book, Think Like a Commoner. There it is. It is a very readable, wide-ranging introduction to the commons with many fascinating examples from all over the world. I highly recommend it. Today, we will hear Mr. Bollier's ideas as a political strategist, which he pursues as the director of the Reinventing the Commons Program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics. During his presentation, Mr. Bollier will stop every 15 minutes or so to ask if there are questions. This is a chance to ask for clarification. After the presentation, Robin Larson will moderate the Q&A and further discussion. At this time in our country's history, we welcome the chance to consider the possibility for improving the prevailing economic system and making life more equitable for all. Now, I am pleased to present David Bollier.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you all for inviting me to be with you today. I've been an activist and scholar on the Commons for maybe 20 years, working mostly internationally, but also in the US. And in my talk, I'd like to give a quick flyby of a lot of the themes raised. And at the end, let's just have an open discussion for any questions or concerns that I provoke along the way. I have a lot of PowerPoint slides that I'm going to show along with my own image as I'm talking, because I found that it helps clarify some of the things I'm talking about. So I will share my screen right now. And as I say, I will pause maybe 15 minutes in to answer any minor clarifications, and we can deal with the big picture questions at the end. So I'll be talking about eco-stewardship in general, social equity, and the commons, but mostly introducing the commons as a social form for pursuing a lot of this. Let me, well, there we go. We start with a premise, I start with a premise that neoliberal capitalism has reached a certain threshold where it's starting to be more destructive. It's really since the Reagan-Thatcher era of 1981, that started in 1981, it started to hollow out the state and its control over a lot of things, which is why we see so much trouble, I think, in electoral politics and policy. Hold on. And I think it's about the market state system, as I call it, but it's chiefly the market and capital extracting value without giving as much back. It's about externalizing cost into the environment, onto communities, onto future generations, and really pitting us against each other as market individualists and elevating market values over all else as a societal principle. Oops. And this is really intensified with the pandemic, which has abruptly confirmed just how dysfunctional, fragile, and unfair the market state system really is. A friend and colleague of mine has called this the microbial destruction of the Western cognitive empire, in the sense that it has started to challenge a lot of core premises that we deal with, such as that individuals are different from the collective, that humans are separate from nature, that the mind is different from the body. There's a lot of these premises that are really unexamined that the pandemic is starting to undermine or challenge. And we're starting to see how global supply chains are very fragile, they're very costly, and they're very ecologically harmful. This is a picture of the big tanker that got stuck in the Suez Canal recently, which had enormous ramifications for global supply chains. And we've seen how the pandemic too has shown how fragile supply chains are. And of course, the carbon fuels for running these chains is enormous and contributing to climate problems. In effect, our reckless actions over time are starting to burn the house we live in, and we're starting to see a reckoning on a number of fronts. And for me, it's about the market state storylines falling apart. They're not effective, they're not seen as trustworthy, and I think a lot of us have an understandable angst that we don't have a credible story for the future. And these are some of the forces that got me to focus on the commons as a possible alternative. It really comes down to we need to expand our imaginations. I love this quote from this author of a book about various experimental projects for changing things, where he said, what if we approach social movement action not as targeting existing political power, but as experimenting with worlds? In other words, creating our own sovereign defensible systems within the system, as opposed to simply working within the frame of electoral politics or policy, important as those are. And I'm really glad we still have people playing there, but we also need to incubate some different visions. And I see the commons as a very versatile new and old form for meeting needs. It's arguably as old as the human race and the default system for how we govern ourselves. But in the past 200 years, with the dominance of capitalism, I think we've forgotten some of these basic elements of human existence, and that commoning, the verb, is really what humans excel at and what they've done over time, as opposed to being individualist competing against each other in markets. Now, unfortunately, the commons is not really seen in our mainstream discourse, because it's seen that the state and the market are the only two consequential forces for producing stuff or governing us, and that the commons is just kind of this archaic relic from another time, something we shouldn't take too seriously. And indeed, mainstream politicians and economists routinely refer to the commons as unowned resources and not as a social system. I think showing betraying their ignorance of history and not understanding that the commons is really a social system. And so we get locked into these debates about, well, should we have capitalism or should we have socialism? And I think that's really an archaic conversation because it's very state-centered, and it doesn't get to the prior sovereignty of people and controlling their lives separate from the state, as if the state were the only capable institution. And we're seeing how the state and state power is not only not necessarily capable for many, many things, it's often destructive or predatory. So the commons works in a space, you might say, outside of the market state. And that's a different way of approaching politics. The one reason the commons is misunderstood is that 50 years ago, a biologist named Garrett Hardin wrote this famous essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. It was a very short piece in Science Journal, and he wrote this. Basically, it was a parable. Imagine you had a pasture in which anybody could graze as many cattle or sheep on it. It will be, he said, it will be overused and overexploited and ruined, because so many people will use it without restraint, because no one has an individual rational justification for not overexploiting it for themselves. And this launched the parable of the tragedy of the commons. Unfortunately, there's a lot of embedded assumptions in the whole story. One scholar of the commons, Lewis Hyde, said, it's really the tragedy of unmanaged laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating self-interested individuals. In other words, it presumes a certain type of humanity, and it presumes that the people who use a certain commons won't talk to each other, won't negotiate with each other, and are incapable of finding solutions by themselves. And this is really just untrue empirically. And it was this woman, Eleanor Ostrom, who helped debunk the tragedy of the commons parable through her scholarship over 30, 40 years. She was an Indiana University political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 in economics for her life work showing that commons are indeed an entirely sustainable system. She's empirically studied it in dozens of countries and helped launch an international body of scholars, the International Association for the Study of the Commons, to basically demonstrate that commons under certain design principles can and do work without being, without overexploiting the resource. In other words, the tragedy story, while resources can be overexploited, there's no question, it's entirely possible for communities to be able to peer organize themselves and sustainably manage, especially depletable resources like water or forest or fisheries or other types of natural resources. Now, it's important to understand that a commons is a peer organized social system, as I mentioned, as opposed to a resource alone. It's the community plus the resource plus the particular social norms and practices and rituals and traditions and other governance approaches that they use to manage it. And this is important to keep in mind because there's different ramifications for how resources can be managed. The market state system likes to call a commons like the oceans or the space or the internet as a commons. Actually, those are potential commons. They're simply common pool resources that are in search of better commons governance. So maybe I'll just pause here for a moment before going into another section of my talk about enclosures of the commons, in case anybody has any questions or clarifications that they'd want at this point so far. I mean, we don't have to pause, but if somebody has some burning issue or clarification, I'm happy to try to resolve it.
Art has a question. Art Persico.
Yeah, so is the commons simply the natural world we share plus the man-made things we share? Is that another way of describing what the
That's
commons?
one, yes, but it's more when people intentionally get together to manage a shared resource, and then they devise certain systems, social norms and protocols and ways of doing it. So it's one organic system of all of that as opposed to just the resource itself. And it's done, you might say, autonomously, meaning it's not done in conjunction with the market or state, even though there might be some modest interactions with both of them. But the point is, it's mostly independent and it's self-driven. So that's really the distinction that needs to be made. Well, you're muted, Robin.
Okay. I was wondering if you could give a couple of examples. I mean, I think of all the state and county park systems.
Yes, I will get to that. I'm going to move into some examples, so you'll have quite a few to deal with.
Oh,
So,
good. Okay, thanks.
But I would just make it one point right now is that there are a lot of things that the government will manage. And I make a distinction by calling them state trustee commons, meaning the state is acting as a trustee for us, as opposed to something that the commoners themselves manage. And there's a distinction because commons in their classic form are something that the commoners are control of. They have a certain self-determination and autonomy, as opposed to delegating that to, say, a bureaucracy or politicians. But I'll get into that in the coming segment. Well, let me continue on then. Nathan, there's somebody in the waiting room. I'm not sure if I should you should let them in, or.
I'm not seeing them.
Oh, okay, then I'll just click on it.
Okay.
And let me go back to my slides and just go to the next section here. Okay, so one important reason for talking about the commons is it lets us talk about enclosures. And this is the idea that basically global capital and business generally want free and subsidized resources, even if they belong to commoners. So for example, lots of natural resources over time have been seized by businesses and turned into private property and then sold on markets. So what was once used as a commons becomes a market resource. And of course, the English enclosure movement in the, well, actually over many centuries, but especially in the 17th and 18th century, was when a lot of this happened, where the landed gentry and aristocrats persuaded Parliament to allow them to take over what used to be commons, pastures and forests and fisheries and so forth. And all the commoners were forced to flee to the cities because they no longer could survive. They didn't have a livelihood. And they became part of the emerging industrial system as either wage slaves or paupers. And this was largely because the commons on which they had subsisted for generations were taken over and privatized. So enclosure is about the privatization and commodification of our shared wealth. Capitalism likes to regard it as progress, but in point of fact, enclosure is often about dispossession and taking things that belong to us collectively and turning them into money-making assets. And I mentioned the English enclosure movement. Right now, we're having the equivalent of that as hedge funds and sovereign investment funds around the world are taking lands in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, and often with the collusion of the governments, turning them over to private investors. Often for speculative purposes, they're not even producing stuff on it. And people who've farmed on those lands or relied on them for wildlife have been evicted, fueling the great urbanization and poverty throughout those continents. So it's not something of the past, it's happening right now. I was astonished to learn that 20% of the human genome is now privately owned as patents. And this has ramifications for what kind of research scientists can do, because they don't want to do research if they're going to infringe on a patent and can't use what they discover. Another example is how intellectual property is expanding a lot. Copyright law claims that, well, in the mid-1990s, there was a famous story of how ASCAP, a music licensing body for copyright holders, was accused the Girl Scouts and a lot of summer camps for singing around the campfire without paying a blanket licensing fee for copyrighted songs, and that constituted a public performance requiring a license. And this was, I just cite this as an example of many in which copyright law and trademark law have been vastly expanded to basically privatize elements of culture that we take for granted as something we should share. And there's countless other market enclosures I could go into. I don't want to dwell on them right now, but everything from seeds to groundwater to public spaces and wilderness areas are being claimed as private property through various forms of law. But commoning as the default human economy, as I mentioned, is really now experiencing quite a resurgence, especially in Europe and the global South, where people see it as a way of pushing back on some of these trends. And I think partly it's because the commons has always been more prevalent than people understood, that there's an estimated 2 billion people whose everyday lives depend upon various subsistence commons. And subsistence doesn't necessarily mean impoverished or just desperate. It simply means they're not engaging in market activity and they're feeding their family or their community without cash necessarily changing hands. And this is arguably a much more stable, ecologically benign form of meeting needs than global markets driven by capital, which are often, as I said, evicting people from their traditional lands and introducing industrial agriculture with all of its pathologies. Now, the commons is really a verb. There's no commons without commoning, the historian Peter Leinbach has said, meaning it's a social activity by which a group of people negotiate with each other, figure out how to best manage their shared wealth. It's about bottom-up cooperation. It's about practical experimentation. So it's not like some ideology that has all the answers run by some centralized institution. It's a very improvisational, experimental, bottom-up, grassroots-based way of figuring out how to manage things. And I think it's not just in far-off lands that may not be so-called developed. In the West and in Europe, there's a lot of relocalization going on, especially driven by climate change, to try to develop a more resilient economy. Community-supported agriculture farms, land trusts as a way to decommodify land so that it's not, prices are not continuing to rise through speculation. The idea of import replacement, where a community develops things that it provides itself, so it doesn't have to be reliant on outside sources for that. There's a number of different strategies going on to relocalize the economy these days. And food production, of course, and distribution is a big part of that. There's a number of movements around the world, like agroecology and permaculture. I mentioned CSA farms. The slow food movement out of Italy has gone international, and it's developing a more locally based forms of both growing, distributing, and enjoying food. Organic farming, of course, is now quite mature and developed. And I mentioned the Fresno Commons here because there's a fascinating experiment going on in Fresno where they've devised a new, basically regional supply system, so that instead of investors siphoning off any profits, basically gets reinvested and mutualized among the participants in the community. And it's a way of making jobs better paid, a way to grow higher quality food without having to use a lot of the industrial monoculture and chemical techniques. So the relocalized food is another aspect of this commons development. The city is being thought of as a commons, especially in many European cities like Amsterdam, Bologna, Italy, and a lot of Italian cities, Barcelona, where they're starting to think of the city as a commons and how citizens should have a bigger role rather than the wealthy investors or absentee capital. So they're trying to get the city government to authorize self-organized groups of commoners, say farmers markets or community gardens or land trusts that can hold buildings rather than allowing Airbnb to turn a lot of neighborhoods into ghost neighborhoods for tourists rather than for the longtime residents. There's a lot of municipal data commons who are trying to do what Uber is doing Uber is doing a lot of ride hailing through the standard capitalist model, but in Austin, for example, there was a ride hailing service that was a so-called platform cooperative. So it's an attempt to try to use some of the technology, but not in exploitive ways. I could go on. I'll mention, I guess, the Wi-Fi net in Barcelona, where instead of relying on the usual cable or telephone companies, there's actually a very large-scale regional Wi-Fi system that is run as a commons. So there's a lot of different examples where this is happening, and much of it is a frontier still, because there's a lot of experimentation about how do we do this in conjunction with the city government, and that requires some different ways of operating. There's a lot of alternative currencies that are trying to recirculate community value rather than have that money being siphoned away to external banks. So I'm associated with the Schumacher Center for New Economics. They have the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, in the Berkshires region of the state. And it's a currency that's accepted by more than 200 merchants. And it's a way of both intensifying regional identity, as well as making sure that the local economy is reinvigorated by the money instead of the money being exported outside to New York or the big financial centers. there's a lot of Bristol pound in Bristol, England is another famous currency. But then the Bangla Pesa is something in Kenya where a neighborhood which had a lot of low income people were able to develop new exchange systems among themselves to help meet each other's needs without having access to the so-called fiat or national currency. The web is really a massive hosting infrastructure for commons. It's more associated with Facebook and Twitter and the corporate players. But in truth, anybody can and has created all sorts of commons. And I suppose the most famous one is the open source software explosion, where Linux, the operating system, and these are symbols from some of the other famous open source systems, like the feather is the logo for Apache, which is an important system in the internet software. LibreOffice is a word processing system. The semicircle, the green circle there is the logo for open access scholarly publishing, which are trying to bypass basically exploitative commercial journal publishers. And the penguin is, of course, the logo for Linux. So let's see if I can go back to the other slide I just went past. I'm sorry. The other slide that preceded this was Creative Commons licenses. Here we go. Let me just start the show from this slide. Creative Commons is a nonprofit based there in San Francisco, which for the past 20 years has created legal licenses that allow copyright holders to put a little license, a free license on their work, whether it's writing or music or video or whatever. And it signals that the work can be shared and reused for free without permission. And it has created vast quantities of different types of content that essentially are born shareable, as opposed to being born as property. And this has opened up lots of creativity and reuse, and allowed many scholars to reach more people, because many of their articles otherwise will be behind expensive paywalls and so forth. So it's a big development in terms of encouraging use of the commons. The next generation after open source software is what is sometimes called Cosmo local production, where you'll have global sharing of designs and then local production of the physical stuff. So for example, FarmHack does agricultural farm equipment, and they can avoid the expense, for example, of a $200,000 John Deere tractor by building something that's obviously more basic, but shareable and locally sourceable. And this is especially important in many contexts like the global South. There's even a car that's been developed this way. Arduino is electronic circuit boards that are freely shareable. They have a trademark on the name, but the design and content can be freely shared without violating any intellectual property laws. And then of course, Fab Labs are a vehicle that are they're basically spaces, usually in urban areas or universities, where people can do all sorts of experimentation, and there's older mentors who help younger tech people, and younger tech people who help old people who don't know about the tech. They're kind of an interesting open space for innovation that's shareable. And then there's even new forms of network-based cooperation that have seemed to be emerging. They're not fully developed, but not unlike Bitcoin, which is kind of a capitalist speculative currency. There's a number of alternative currencies or types of shareable content or shareable protocols, like Holochain, which is kind of an answer to Bitcoin. Ethereum, digital autonomous organizations is a lot of people are trying to develop ways that organizations can be autonomous in digital spaces while being able to verify the identity of the participants. This is a more complex than I can go into right now, but I just wanted to point to these trying to develop digital platforms that allow cooperation more readily than simply the web. Maybe I won't go into this too much, except I just wanted to differentiate. There are different types of activity on the internet. You know, the Facebook is basically standard capitalism, sometimes called netarchical capital, meaning it's using the network, but it's pursuing the usual capitalist motives. Bitcoin is also capitalist, but it's distributed, meaning it's not centralized like Facebook. But on the right side of this chart, you can see there's a lot of things like Wikipedia, which functions as a global commons, or you might say national commons, because there's dozens of different language versions of Wikipedia today. And there's even distributed local versions of commons, such as the Transition Town movement or the Cosmo local production that I just mentioned, which are combined, the global and the local. So I just wanted to make some of these distinctions so that we didn't think that just because the prominence of Twitter, Facebook, and all the rest, that defines it. There are all sorts of commons-based alternatives that are possible on the internet. One of them being a class of systems called platform cooperatives, where it's basically taking the well-known cooperative model, but devising network platforms for the sharing of money, the sharing of governance, so that it's more benign and humane than the Silicon Valley model. And I think one lesson from all of this is that commons can arise anywhere. There's not like some master inventory. It's like whenever a community of people get together and they decide they want to manage a certain set of resources for their collective benefit, and then to make them socially benign or constructive, you can create a commons. In Boston, there's this theater commons, which consists of all sorts of non-commercial and local theater people, actors, dramaturgs, theater companies, and so forth. There's an open humanitarian OpenStreetMap that used the OpenStreetMap software to devise digital maps when there's a natural catastrophe like the Haiti earthquake or many others. So I mentioned GuiFiNet, and there's a whole initiative to develop seed as open source, meaning to prevent the ag biotech companies from patenting them all and preventing people from reusing seeds, which is one of the more terrible aspects of GMOs. So maybe I can pause there before going into the last part of my talk, but that I just wanted to share those range of examples to give you a sense of the diversity of commons out there, and then I'll go into the final third of my talk. So, any quick questions, or Dave, go ahead.
There was a question from a member of the real estate co-op, or I guess you would call it a real estate co-op. It's a co-op that I belong to called Francis Square, and that was one that you did not mention as a commons.
Well, believe me, there's countless others I didn't mention, but
yeah,
if that's associated with the Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland, yeah, that's a fantastic operation.
No, this is actually in San Francisco, across from Japan Center. And it's an autonomously functioning co-op, and people own the interior spaces of their living units, and I think there are 200 or 300 units.
That's a fantastic example too. I mean, there's co-ops. I would just stress that the organizational form is not the be-all end-all, because there needs to be the social culture and norms as well. Because many co-ops, like REI, the camping equipment people, the outdoor people, is basically function like a corporation.
Right, right.
So, you know, it is very important that the culture and social practices be there as well.
I had a couple of clarification type questions. In relocalization, you mentioned permaculture, and I don't know what that word means.
Well, there's a tradition of people who have a whole developed school of thought about working with nature rather than just extracting from nature. And there's some principles. Bill Mollison was, I guess, the godfather of a lot of this movement, but there's many different branches of it. And it's a way of growing things that is more respectful and interactive of the earth, and of course localized as well.
Okay. And could you say, you mentioned alternative currencies such as Berkshires and the Bristol pound. Could you kind of give just a common view, as an overview as to what advantages these confer over conventional currencies?
Well, part of it is identity, where people are encouraged to buy local, and therefore they're supporting the local and regional economy, as opposed to simply buying at a franchise, a Home Depot or something, in which the franchise is basically absentee or global, or the banks that support it are. So this is about getting more economic activity to be locally intensive, because the money is circulating there as opposed to leaving town.
Okay, thank you. That
There's you've got a hand up with a question from Art Persico, who's written some things here in the chat.
Just a quick one about a hot local issue that could be looked at through the lens of the commons, and that would be City College of San Francisco and our California's community college system, and then the larger public education, higher education public system in California. Would you agree that's a...
Yes, although the one difference would be that many of those are state run, which introduces a different dynamic from a classic commons. But let me just say, they're often more responsive to the community. And I think the example that immediately comes to mind is how a lot of community college students can't afford expensive textbooks. You know, a lot of commercial textbook publishers publish a new edition every year or two simply to get the professor to buy, you know, to have to assign it, and then the old books lose their value. But the community college is, especially, I forget the name of the particular one in California there, I think it was in the Bay Area, helped spearhead a new effort to develop open textbooks, where the discipline or somebody, some author, essentially donates it to the commons, and then there's a stewardship of this resource where it's updated periodically, and it's all printable for, it can be print on demand at cost, or at cost plus a tiny margin. So you can get a textbook for $10, $20 instead of $150. So community colleges were behind that because they understood. And so I think that in that sense, while in some ways community colleges are a creature of the state, they also conserve the commons or use their in-kind resources to do so.
Good.
So maybe should I continue on unless there's another question? Okay, let me just get back to screen share. Okay, now one thing that I try to point out is that the commons involves a different worldview. Whoops, am I coming through all right? Okay. And there's old worldviews can prevent us from seeing things. And I like to illustrate this from how in the 1840s here in my hometown I'm in Amherst, Massachusetts, the president of Amherst College saw these footprints in the sandstone, and he was trying to make sense of what they were. The word dinosaur had not been coined yet. Darwin had not published. He was immersed in the biblical worldview of creationism. And he thought that they were tracks from flying turkeys or big birds. And the point is that these old worldviews often prevent us from seeing in the bigger picture or interpreting empirical realities in a different way. And I think that's partly what's going on with the commons, because I think today's archaic perspective is market capitalism, where value is seen as defined by price. And if it doesn't have a price and is exchangeable in markets, then it's not really worth too much. And progress is seen as commodifying things, privatizing it, and economic growth is progress. And we're seeing how that whole concept is really just dysfunctional in a world in which the world is finite, and the atmosphere cannot continue to absorb further growth, at least carbon-driven growth. And free trade is seen really as, it's really competitive extraction of resources, again, something that has distinct limits. And I would just recommend Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics book for a brilliant and lucid debunking of a lot of these ideas. But the point is, the commons is really about seeing reality through the lens of relationality, through our relationships with each other, with the natural world. And value is this living phenomena and not simply dead capital, which people are using to make money off of and colonizes the living world. And unlike the tragedy of the commons thesis, commoning is generative and value creating, as the examples I showed suggest. When people get together, they can be naturally creative, and it's not chiefly because of capital, although infrastructure and law and many other things are often important. It's about the social relationships of the people coming together to common. And it's a constructive worldview, an ethic, and operational logic that really, I think, can go toe-to-toe with market economics and show that it can meet a lot of needs. This is not to say it's an either-or proposition. You know, the state and the market will continue to exist and continue to have important roles in our lives. It's just that the commons can carve out some more humane alternatives along the way. So it's important to see the commons as this universe of non-market value, or at least it's not necessarily quantified as price. And it's about these types of values of fairness and responsibility connected to entitlements. And it's about long-term stewardship and meeting basic needs first. An important concept is inalienability. Some things are not for sale in the market, and that's especially true in the commons. And commons, unlike looking to the state for how to run things, are peer governed. So you have greater direct access for how things will be done. And custom and tradition are very important in this world as well. So, as I've gotten deeper into the commons, I've come to realize that the inner life matters too. It's not as if you're homo economicus, this rational utility maximizing individual. Your inner life participates in the commons. And the reason I have this image is it's because this is the way we Westerners see the great sandy desert in Australia. But let me show you the way that the indigenous people there see it. They see it like that, and that's their map. And the point is that they have a far deeper emotional, spiritual relationship with the landscape than we do, who tend to regard nature as something separate and other, whereas they regard it as part of their life and culture and spiritual lives. And in some ways, you could say that commoning is about world making, because you're making this richer world that's both inner and connected to the outer world. It's really about a politics of belonging, and it's about an economics of sufficiency, meaning unlike market economics, which really has no limits and sees infinite growth as progress, the commons recognizes our limitations of the natural world. And finally, it's a culture that decommodifies and shares, as opposed to trying to create as much capital and accumulate that. So the idea is that the commons really starts to force us to rethink our very language, and to see that, for example, resources are not just resources. So we invented the term care wealth to show that people have relationships to things. They're not just a commodity or a price. Development is not simply market growth, it's a human and inner development as well. So there's a lot of the binaries below of public, private, individual, collective, rational, irrational. In a commons, those blur together, and you don't have these, I consider them false binaries. which is why we sort of need some new language and new vocabulary. As I mentioned, the care wealth. I like the idea of the nested I. We're nested within these larger communities and within the ecosystem, as opposed to being this ahistorical, isolated individual. And economic rationality thinks it's rational to be selfish, acquisitive, greedy, materialistic. Whereas Ubuntu rationality takes, the word Ubuntu is from South African Bantu people, who Ubuntu means I am because we are. And so it starts to say that that's the more rational way to approach things. And I just wanted to, I'm not going to go through all these words, but I just wanted to suggest that our language itself often has these hidden prescriptions or barriers that don't let us move to a different place. I will just go through this quickly, but I wanted to, in terms of environmental stewardship, the Commons is more resilient because of some of these factors. It honors diversity and wholeness, yet it also allows modularity. So what we do locally matters, but that's part of this larger global diversity. And it's all based on social connection. It's adaptable and dynamic. And unlike current market global supply chains, and it deals with trusted feedback loops so that we know what's going on the ground. And it's, again, holistic. There's this interdependence of humanity and the more than human. Nature is not simply out there, it's part of us, and we internalize our relationships with it. So that's sort of my quick overview of I have a few more. I'm sorry, this is not the concluding slide, but I just wanted to go back here. This is the book that I released a year and a half ago that is more the advanced version, you might say, of the inner dynamics of commons. The book that Dave mentioned, Think Like a Commoner, is really a quick introduction to the commons, which is more accessible. This is a longer, more detailed treatment. I will skate through some of this, just say, because I'm running a little bit over time here, but in this book, we talk about provisioning, social life, and peer governance as different realms of activity in the commons. And within each of those, there are certain patterns. And these are just an example. And these are meant to be kind of touchstones for people to, in a very concrete way, figure out how they can learn how to common more as a verb. And these are some of the practices and ethics that they generally have to try to preserve the commons over time, because there's a certain trick to it. How to scale the commons and build up the commons verse. Scale implies centralized control and consolidation. The commons is really about that diversity. So we use the term emulate and federate so that everything can be in the right scale locally with the kind of responsiveness, but they can also have relationships and federate with larger systems so they can continue to have an influence. And there's a lot of commons public partnerships that are being explored these days, especially in Europe, where they're looking for city and sometimes national governments to formally recognize and facilitate commoning to do stuff that bureaucracies simply don't do very well. So this is about, just to conclude here, this is about getting real where we live. I love this quote from Buckminster Fuller, who said, in order to change an existing paradigm, you do not struggle to change the problematic model. You create a new model and make the old one obsolete. And I like that because it helps you start afresh without having to disentangle yourself from a lot of the baggage and legacy problems of old systems. And it's an attempt to try to start afresh. And I think that's what many commons are about, without being puristic about it either, because many commons are really hybrids and they do the best they can of the circumstances that they're born into. So that's where I think an ethical dimension of the commons is all about. I just add that this is really not isolated. You could say that many of these movements listed here are active in their own way in commoning, sometimes with that language and sometimes not, but the ethic and the practices are often very much aligned with the commons. And I like this quote, the next big thing will be a lot of small things. If we're going to deal with something as big as climate change, it's not going to be because a national government or an international body has declared this is the way it's going to be, because it can't deal with distributed complexity. It can't earn the trust of people. It can't induce people to contribute their passionate element of creativity and innovation. So I think it's having the appropriate scale of things, but then having them federated and cooperative and aligned so that they can have a bigger impact. But it has to be down at the cellular level, you might say. So that's a quick flyby of a lot of material. We could talk more extensively about many of the themes I've raised, and let's have a conversation. These are some of the books that I've written. The two ones on the top are both available for free online, patternsofcommoning.org and wealthofthecommons.org. They're anthologies of essays about different aspects of the commons, and these are some of my other books. So with that, let's just have a broader conversation. Oops, you're muted, David. Dave.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Bollier. That was a fast race through a lot of material, but a lot of interesting ideas. So I would like to ask Robin Larson to moderate the Q&A and further discussion. Robin, do you want to unmute yourself?
These are a couple of questions earlier to by Art that I think you dealt with in part. So I don't know how much more to.
Let me just look at you're talking about in the chat.
Yes, as a public community college, a commons, our local community college is under threat of privatization and is in the process of being reduced in its offerings to the public.
Well,
there are foundations with a profit motive pushing the agenda for cutting the budget. Is this a good example of the commons and a threat to it?
Yes, I think of the state-run commons. The state is often a vehicle for our common ethics. It's not as I mentioned before, it's not a classic commons, but the effort to commodify and privatize public resources, whether they're public forests, national parks, community colleges, is a phenomenon that affects both public assets as well as commons assets. And it's the same phenomena of private investors and capital trying to take over these things. Invariably, it's an act of dispossession and basically not allowing us to have our own infrastructures and equity to manage things in a more humane, cheaper, responsive way than whatever the markets can provide.
Well,
So,
Art's next comment about it kind of relates to what you're just saying. He says, is it appropriate and useful for us as activists to use the concept of the commons to push for a people's agenda that is translated into policy, law, and is in other ways integrated into our lived reality through politics?
Absolutely. The only caveat I have is some people see the commons as a way to rebrand conventional liberalism or socialism. And that's where I sort of disagree, because socialism is state-run collective management as opposed to peer-run or self-organized. And the state has its own imperatives, electoral politics has its own imperatives, which are often, I think, at cross purposes from the self-determination of a commons working locally, bottom up, in a more peer organized way. So I would make that little distinction, but the commons is definitely about trying to develop a people's agenda.
There's also one, I think this is also from Art, when it comes to the internet, Can we reinforce the commons aspects of the internet by creating nonprofit alternatives to Facebook?
Yes, although those are major problems because developing something of that sophistication, a platform of that sophistication, takes a lot of money. And there are efforts through this platform cooperativism movement. If you Google platform cooperativism, you'll be able to see a lot of the examples where they are trying to develop workable platforms that are simply not rip and run investor vehicles. And so, yeah, nonprofit is maybe part of the answer, but it's more about forms of ways that people can have participation and governance of those vehicles as opposed to just a nonprofit. But yes, the answer in general to that question is yes.
And then here's a question of actually about your slides of being of great value. Is it possible for these slides to be sent to the attendees?
Sure, I could maybe put them on a, I think the SlideShare website, which is kind of a repository for these with a link. That might be easier than sending out a big file to everyone.
SlideShare website.
Yeah, we can circle back to Dave, and you can maybe let people know the link once I do that.
Oh, good. That sounds like a very reasonable.
Yeah.
Well, I think
good.
that brings us to the end. Oh, one comment from Betty Trainer, fellow co-op person at St. Francis Square, where we both live. And Betty is really the saint of St. Francis Square. There are many residential co-ops in San Francisco besides St. Francis Square.
Well, I mean, co-ops are an enormously important vehicle for commoning. And again, I just sort of mentioned how people not self-delude themselves, say, well, the legal organizational form is in place, that's settled that. When in fact, I think there's still a very important role for practice and culture in social solidarity within those communities. And in fact, some co-ops are really proactively enabling. In other words, they're not just unto themselves, but trying to, there's this co-housing movement in Germany, for example, that has a pay it forward fund, which is a source of capital for acquiring more buildings to turn into residential co-housing. So
there have been some people in our co-op who've talked about building an additional, in fact, a high rise, which would have office space and doctors'
Fantastic.
offices. And then that would be a more self-supporting entity that could enable us to have below market housing.
And I would encourage you to check out Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland. That they have a radical real estate school in which they have housing activists who are learning the law, and you don't have to take the bar, but you can be an apprentice under California law to become a lawyer. And they're just at the forefront of a lot of very innovative cooperative and other organizations.
How would people Google that?
Just Sustainable Economies Law Center.
Okay, Sustainable Economies Law Center.
Right.
Oakland. There's someone here who has her hand up. Is that Karen without a, well, here's a person with a number.
That could be Bob Birchfield. Okay.
Oh, well,
Here.
Karen.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's probably me.
There he is. What's your question?
Hi. I just wanted to bring up, you mentioned Facebook. I just wanted to bring up Amazon. I see Amazon as a much bigger threat to the retail commons, although retail itself is a market aspect. There's still sort of like a commons form of retailing where you go to a local retail shops and stuff like
Right.
that, purchasing things in person. There's more of a social aspect to it, and Amazon seems to be doing a pretty good job of eroding that entire segment of our economy. Do you have anything to say about that?
I can't quarrel with it. I suppose there's 4 or 5 major tech players, and Amazon is, you're right, a very serious destroyer of localism. You know, I'm in a university town, and we used to have 5 or 6 bookstores. Now the last one is struggling, and the local university, UMass, has entered into contracts with Amazon rather than local bookstores. You know, it's that kind of stuff, which and I find that the language of the commons helps us step outside of these natural market evolutions, as they would portray them, because they're more efficient or whatever, and start to bring in these other values like localism and self-determination and non-market considerations. But yeah, Amazon is a serious threat, and I totally agree with you.
Dave, do you have a question?
I have a question that's, maybe a bit too technical, but a ways back, you stated that 20% of the human genome is now patented.
Yes.
I thought I read within the last week that human genes are not patentable. So
Well,
could you maybe straighten that out?
Yes, the first claim was there was a article in Nature magazine, I would estimate 4 or 5 years ago, that made the 20% estimate. It is true there was a Supreme Court case dealing with the breast cancer susceptibility gene, which this Utah company, Myriad Genetics, I believe it was, owned, and the Supreme Court partially agreed and partially disagreed with that case, where you can still own types of genetic material. There's a famous case from the 80s where the Chakrabarty case, where bacteria can be owned, and it was the first case in which a living something could be patented. So you'd have to look at the technical details of that, but there's certainly all sorts of things, genetic information and knowledge that can be owned. How much of human genes, I'd have to review that the Myriad Genetics Supreme Court case. So,
Nathan has a question, I think. Isn't that Nathan?
Yeah, I raised my hand. So it seems like some of this, right, we're talking about learned patterns that seem more than just natural. They're just like the way the world is. I read a book recently called Capitalist Realism by a former professor named Mark Fisher, which, posits that, we live in this world where we can't imagine anything other than, markets and like market efficiencies. And I'm just kind of curious about how, if you have thoughts. I mean, you mentioned a few things about like unlearning those practices, or like where to start. And just really quick, I know, like, I went to a presentation years ago in San Francisco that I found fascinating about decentralized gray water reuse on like a block by block or multi scale, right? And it makes a lot of sense. And somewhere like California, we're in the middle of a drought. It's like every day you see in the paper, we have to cut back, we have to cut back. And if you actually think about how the city of San Francisco uses water, there's 200 pumps that use a ton of energy to get this water, from the mountains, 200 pumps just within the city, right, into the city. They pump it all around. But the technology exists for a lot of the things you're talking about to just go do it. But it seems unfathomable to us to actually just start installing local gray water block to block.
I mean, the griefing net that I mentioned, the Wi-Fi system in Barcelona, this guy jerry-rigged a mesh network in his apartment building, and then volunteers started saying, oh, I want that access too. And it basically grew organically like that by volunteers until it reached a certain scale and they got more formalized. But you're right, a lot of this technology can be used, but there's often state laws that get in the way. For example, communities are often prevented from starting their own Wi-Fi systems. And I'm sure there might be other laws that those industries have gotten on their own behalf, self-protectively, to prevent the competition from smaller scale versions or by commons. So it can get complicated, but you're right. There's a lot of solutions here. It's just that our imaginations and the law often get in the way.
And just plain energy.
Yes, that's true. And yes, and I think I find it so refreshing to work with Europeans because they often are not as enthralled to this conventional wisdom as we American market individualists, where the culture is so locked down in a way, and there are so few renegade efforts that are possible, or you think you're focused nationally and say, well, I can't do anything. But of course, if you think locally or regionally, the way people say in Vermont famously do, you can get a lot done. So how do we liberate ourselves?
That's a good question.
Good question.
I believe we are at the end of our questions here.
Okay.
If that's the case.
I think
Art has a question, and there's also a hand up for the number 162-823-57987. I don't know what that is, but go ahead,
Well, you
Art.
see, the problem, wait, the problem with, I put my hand up a while ago and I asked my question and it was all taken care of. But the problem is that I do not have the ability to put my hand down on my own. The host of the session has to do that.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much for explaining. Art, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. I thank you for this presentation. I really appreciate the ability to ask you questions. I hope I'm not taking up too much time with those, but I love that slide that you had up. The next big thing will be a lot of small things. It kind of reminds me of E.F. Schumacher and Small is Beautiful. And I think there's a through line, obviously, from E.F. Schumacher to you today. And maybe
Well,
I'd love to hear a bit about that connection.
I'm thrilled to be, I work with the Schumacher Center for New Economics, which of course was inspired by Schumacher's work in Small and Beautiful. But you prompt me, Art, to give 3 plugs. One, my blog, Bollier.org, in case you want to sort of browse my years of blogging on this stuff. I have a monthly podcast called Frontiers of Commoning, which can be accessed via the website. There's a logo for Frontiers of Commoning. I have a monthly conversation with somebody who's sort of in the vanguard of the commons in one way or another. And well, I guess that's the only plugs I'll have, just to
Just a quick addition to the E.F. Schumacher Society. In the 1980s, my husband and I used to drive all the way up from Philadelphia to the meetings.
Oh, did you really?
Yes,
Wow.
they were wonderful.
They're continuing strong, and it's now, they changed their name before I joined them to the Schumacher Center for New Economics. They used to be the Schumacher Society, but they're doing much the same work, and they're one of the few organizations that focus on localism and regionalism and Schumacher style economic thinking.
I had the privilege to hear Jane Jacobs rile all these young theorists who are ready to just kill her.
Yes. Well, I mean, I in the same spirit, I love to cite this Kate Rayworth, which I mentioned in my slides, because she wrote this book called Donut Economics, which basically deconstructs the fallacies of conventional economics and what the 21st century economics needs to look like to take account of the realities of a finite world, network systems, and so on.
Our criminal Pacific Gas and Electric keeps getting state laws passed to protect its monopolistic powers. So that's pretty frustrating too.
Yes, and maybe that should be attacked as an impediment for dealing with climate change, because there's all this pent-up local creativity that could start to pioneer some new innovations if they just got it out of the hands of the sit on your hands monopolies.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for a very.
Thank you for having me. I appreciated having this opportunity to share these ideas with you and just to have this conversation. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much.